Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for today's installment of the Wednesday webinar series. Today's topic is mixed finance development, what it is, and how it can help. My name is Antonella Salmeron, and I am the host for today. Before I pass it over to our presenters, I have a few housekeeping items. Our presenters will share their knowledge with us for the first part of the presentation, and then we will reserve the remaining time for any questions that you might have. You may ask questions using the Q&A function on Zoom. Unfortunately, chat is not enabled for this session, so please use the Q&A function down below your screen. I will monitor and read the questions, and if we are unable to address all of them, we will send an email reply after webinar. All webinar participants are muted as well. If you like to notify our team of any technical difficulties, you can reach out via email. I will put that email on the chat as well. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on Hot Exchange in 2 weeks following the webinar. That same applies for the presentation that you see on screen. Immediately following the webinar, you either will be redirected or you will receive an invitation to complete a survey on today's webinar, and we kindly ask that you complete it and provide us any feedback that you might have. So a quick reminder that all materials from previous sessions within this series are available on Hot Exchange. We're providing you with the links here, and these are not all of the webinars. We have even more dating back to 2020, so do feel free to go through those and revisit some of that content. Our speakers for today are Tess Newland, the team leader for the Office of Urban Revitalization, and Avi Ogumbola, grant manager for the same team. Without further ado, Tess, please take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm looking at the participant list and I see a lot of names I recognize. So I know that we have a diverse crowd on the line. We have some people who have done several mixed finance deals. We have some who have not done any. So I'm hoping that this presentation today will speak to everyone. We are going to start with a very high-level, basic overview of what mixed finance is. But during the Q&A, I welcome and invite you to ask more specific, detailed questions about the process. So without further ado, I'll give a roadmap of today's presentation. So we are going to talk about what mixed finance is, how PHAs can use it, how PHAs can put together a mixed finance development proposal, and we'll conclude by providing a brief overview of the HUD approval process. So, next slide, please. So I wanted to start by giving some context of why we're all here and why the whole repositioning webinar series is so important and so relevant. As you all know, the public housing portfolio today faces billions of dollars in capital needs. And in many instances, a PHA's annual capital fund allocation simply is not large enough to address all of the capital needs of its properties. As a result, PHAs need to find other sources of financing to revitalize their existing public housing units and to create new ones. Next slide. Throughout the repositioning webinar series, we've been talking about a number of valuable tools that can help PHAs put their public housing portfolio on a financially sustainable platform and address long-standing capital needs. Some of those tools are repositioning tools that PHAs can use to transition public housing units to the Section 8 platform. These can be great tools. RAD, Section 18, all of these tools can help PHAs secure a large infusion of cash and financing to rehabilitate distressed units. We also know through our conversations with PHAs that a lot of PHAs want to retain their public housing units as public housing. And there are numerous tools on the left hand of your slide that can help PHAs do that. Today in our presentation, we're focusing on a tool that can kind of span the gap between retaining public housing as public housing and repositioning public housing units to another assistance type. And that tool is mixed finance development. Next slide. So what is mixed finance? The essence and definition of mixed finance development is it is the development of public housing units that are owned in whole or in part by an entity other than a PHA. So the best way to understand mixed finance is to contrast it with what I would say is quote unquote traditional public housing development. When I think of traditional public housing development, the public housing that was developed in the 60s and 70s, I think of a public housing development that is 100% public housing, and that is solely, directly, and exclusively owned by the PHA. The PHA itself, not its instrumentality, not its affiliate, is the sole direct owner of the property. The traditional public housing units are typically financed solely with public housing capital and operating funds, and many of these developments are still very successful. As I said earlier, though, many of these developments do now have significant capital needs and thus need to leverage non-public housing funds. And mixed finance is a tool that can help PHAs do that. So one of the most helpful elements of mixed finance is by allowing public housing units to be owned by a third party. Mixed finance makes it possible for PHAs to utilize the largest source of financing for affordable housing development in the country. And that is the low-income housing tax credit. If a property is solely owned by a PHA, it can't use LIHTC. It can't apply for them. It can't secure them. It can't use that valuable tax credit equity for rehab and redevelopment. However, by allowing public housing units to be owned by a non-PHA entity, mixed finance development makes it possible for PHAs to partner with other entities and secure low-income housing tax credits to revitalize and redevelop their properties. And to this end, I would say 9 out of 10 mixed finance projects our office approves are owned by tax credit partnerships. So the most common driver of mixed finance is a desire to utilize LIHTC to help redevelop public housing or develop new public housing. Next slide. Now, since 2000, we have seen more than 600 mixed finance projects produced by PHAs of all sizes across the nation. And those projects have produced 80,000 housing units, often in mixed income communities. They have also leveraged a lot of other financing. In general, PHAs have used $2.6 billion in public housing funds to leverage more than $8 billion in non-public housing funds, including, of course, LIHTC, but also private mortgages and soft secondary loans from cities and states. If you're doing the math, on average, for every $1 public housing authorities have invested in mixed finance development over the last 25 years, they've leveraged at least $3 in non-public housing funds. And I must say that the leveraging power has only grown over time. So in the mixed finance projects we've closed more recently, I often see a leverage ratio of 1 to 14, 1 to 15, 1 to 20. So PHAs can use mixed finance development to do a number of things. They can use them to rehabilitate public housing units, to redevelop public housing sites, to develop new public housing units, either on PHA land or on non-PHA land, and to acquire housing to bring into the public housing program. Now, for those of you who have been with us throughout the repositioning series, you might be a bit surprised because we are talking a lot about public housing development. And obviously, the focus of this series is really talking about repositioning public housing units. Well, the reason why mixed finance is such an important part of the repositioning conversation is, again, that it can allow PHAs to kind of have the best of both worlds. So using mixed finance, PHAs can develop properties that still have public housing units, but also have a variety of other unit types that can generate higher cash flows during the operations period. So we've already, next slide, please. We've already talked a lot about the benefits of mixed finance development, but the most important benefit for all of us, I know, is that mixed finance development can help create high quality housing for low-income families. That is the most important part of our work, no matter what tool you're using. Another benefit I will highlight here is that many PHAs undertaking mixed finance development do so by partnering with third-party developers. A lot of PHAs have their own instrumentality through the development, but others do look for that third-party development partner, and that can be a valuable resource. It can help a PHA undertake an ambitious mixed income project, and it can also help the PHA build their own development capacity over the long term. Next slide, please. So now that we've talked about what mixed finance development is, which is its the development of public housing units that are not exclusively owned by a PHA, I wanted to dive into the details of how mixed finance actually works. And as I said earlier, one of the most common uses of mixed finance is to redevelop existing public housing sites, often with mixed income communities. Now, in order for a PHA to do this, though, they have to partner with the Special Applications Center, because a PHA cannot undertake the mixed finance development of a public housing site until it has permission from the Special Applications Center to dispose of that site to a new owner entity. So the first step in the mixed finance development process for an existing public housing site is having that conversation with the SAC. So as soon as a PHA kind of knows what they want to do with the site, they know the unit mix, that's when I would approach the SAC to talk about a disposition approval. If the PHA is also going to demolish the existing units, they would also need demolition approval. Now, in order to obtain these two approvals, it is important to emphasize that the PHA needs to meet the SAC's disposition and/or demolition criteria. In the great majority of mixed finance projects, the PHAs can meet the SAC's criteria because they can show that their developments are physically obsolete. A second key point for thinking about how mixed finance works with Section 18 is thinking about how PHAs use their tenant protection vouchers. So when a PHA has to relocate tenants due to a disposition or a demolition, they of course receive tenant protection vouchers. And under mixed finance, a PHA can choose what they want to do with those TPVs. So depending on the PHA's local market and their public housing residents' needs, the PHA could choose to use some of their tenant protection vouchers as project-based vouchers at the new development. Because in mixed finance, PHAs aren't required to rebuild 100% of the public housing units as public housing. They have flexibility to rebuild a development that can include a variety of different unit types that can meet their residents' needs. So again, with mixed finance, a PHA could create a development that had public housing and project-based vouchers. So let's go to the next slide and look at an example of mixed finance development in practice. Next slide. So this is an example of a full-scale redevelopment of an existing public housing site. And again, this is not by all means every mixed finance project, but this is a common mixed finance project. So in the late 2000s, the Housing Authority of the City of Pittsburgh decided to redevelop an existing public housing site with 105 barrack-style public housing units. And as I was talking about, one of the PHA's first steps in the development process was going to the stack and getting that Section 18 disposition approval to redevelop the site using mixed finance development. So the housing authority of the city of Pittsburgh had 105 units on 17 acres of land. It's a lot of land. So they had room to densify the site. And as a result, over 4 phases developed over several years, Pittsburgh was able to build a 225 unit mixed income community that had 123 public housing units, 53 LIHTC only units, and 49 market rate units. So at the end of this, the original site had more public housing units than it originally held, but it also had a mix of other income types. And again, highlighting the financial benefits of mixed finance development, in phase 4 of the redevelopment of Garfield Heights, which you can see on your screen, the PHA used $9.2 million in public housing capital funds to leverage $10 million in private and other funding to develop 50 units. So you'll see again, with mid-finance development, PHAs are able to secure a variety of financing to produce a mixed income community. Next slide. Now, in the last slide, I talked about a very common use of mixed finance development over previous years. Now I want to talk about the latest trend in mixed finance development, which is probably why a lot of y'all are dialed in today. But mixed finance is the Faircloth side of Faircloth-to-RAD. And as many of you may know, via Faircloth-to-RAD, a public housing authority can take advantage of their unused Faircloth authority, meaning the number of public housing units that is authorized to build but don't currently have. And they can use that unused Faircloth authority to build, rehab, or acquire new public housing units that have pre-approval to convert to a Section 8 platform via RAD. For our purposes today, the key thing for y'all to know is that in order to do Faircloth-to-RAD, a PHA has to go through the full mixed finance development process, because you can't have a RAD unit unless you have a public housing unit. So we have to go through the whole mixed finance public housing approval process to ensure that the PHA is creating a public housing unit that meets all the requirements of the public housing program, and then can pretty immediately convert to RAD. One key innovation that I think is very, very valuable about Faircloth-to-RAD is during the underwriting process, which happens once as part of the mixed finance approval process, the PHA can use its anticipated RAD rents. And because RAD rents are often a little bit higher, not always, but often they are, those slightly higher RAD rents can make it easier for PHA to secure private financing. Next slide. So this is an example of a Faircloth-to-RAD project our office approved a couple years ago. It was done over 2 phases, and over the 2 phases, the Gainesville Housing Authority produced 166 units. And it was a mixture of LIHTC only, public housing / RAD units, and market rate units. A key thing to know about this project is throughout the development period, the PHA was developing public housing units. And then once those units achieved DOFA date, the PHA was able to use their pre-approval to fairly immediately convert those units to RAD. I think the PHA concluded the RAD conversion process in about 60 days after the construction completion. So it's a quick project, it's a streamlined process, and this is another great tool in use of mixed finance development. So now we're going to go to the next slide. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Ali Agambula, who can talk to you in more detail about the mixed finance development process and some of the key decisions a PHA faces throughout that process.
Well, thank you very much, Tess. I'm going to try to build up on what you have already discussed. So, folks, so here we are. You want to do a mixed finance transaction. How do you go about it? This is one easy way to talk you through how you do this. Assuming that you've gotten your disposition and assuming that you want to do this redevelopment on a public housing site, you must have obtained your disposition from SAC. You must have procured a developer or a development team, outside counsel, and so on and so forth. If we assume you've done all of that, so you're at the pre-development stage. This stage, you will contact your local public housing office and discuss the possibility of doing a mixed finance transaction. Because at this stage, you will have had everything that you will need. Process-wise, sometimes you may require to spend money for pre-development if your developer is not capable to spend the required amount of money to get you through closing or development. At this stage, we can be of assistance, whereby you can request certain assistance from us, and can grant that. We have this process whereby PHAs can request up to 75% of a pre-development request. So for an example, if you're looking for a pre-development amount of $100,000, we can help the PHA advance up to $75,000. And the developer will provide the remaining 25. To do that, you just reach out to our office and we'll work with you to advance that money. And for that funds, you can use it to do what you've seen on the screen. Create really marketing study, development plan, site plan, environmental, and everything that you will need to bring to us and your potential lender for a full-fledged approval. Again, at this stage, you will have a team in place. So that's what you do at the pre-development. At the pre-development stage, you would also be assigned a grant manager like me to work with you so that you are not navigating these by yourself. So once we get through the pre-development phase to get you ready, we then go to development. Next slide, please. So at the development, maybe go back and talk about key decisions for a PHA to really be mindful of before you really decide to do mixed finance transaction. There are several possibilities for PHA role-wise. You can be a lender. What do we mean by being a lender? Because you're going to be lending your capital funds or operating subsidy to the owner of the development. That's the lender role. You can be a landowner. Given your SAC disposition approval, you can lease the land to the owner entity. You can be a developer if you want. Your affiliate or instrumentality can be a developer or a co-developer of the project. You may also decide to be part of the ownership entity. You know, there are so many possibilities of what a PHA can do when it comes to owner entity, but it is not going to be the PHA itself. It will be the PHA's instrumentality or affiliate. Of course, you can be a property manager if you have the in-house capacity. And then finally, you can be an asset manager. So these are the possible roles a PHA can play. While we're talking about this, it's also very instructive for PHA to understand what it takes to be part of a mixed finance transaction. To the extent that at the end of the compliance period, which is 15 years, a decision will have to be made by the PHA whether they want to exercise their right of first refusal to own the development if the PHA is not the developer or the co-developer. So what am I trying to say? At the end of the 15 years, the project has to be in it. At the end of the 15 years, the ownership entity may elect to give the PHA an option to take over the project because the compliance period is over. As Tess mentioned earlier, the way one of the predominant funding sources of mixed finance transaction is the low-income housing tax credit. And part of the regulations of that is it's good for 15 years. After 15 years, the ownership entity can be exchanged to somebody else as long as the compliance continues, that the project remains affordable. So these are the decisions PHs have to be comfortable with and make one before you really decide to do mixed finance. Next slide, please. Step 2 is development. So we've got a team. We've got disposition approval from SAC. We've got pre-development money. Now, what do we need to do? You and your developer will apply for tax credit, and that one has its own process. If you're doing a Faircloth-to-RAD, one of the important things is you have to request a NAR, and NAR stands for Notice of Anticipated RAD Rent. Notice of Anticipated RAD Rent. And that's one of the beauty of the Faircloth-to-RAD transaction. Because with the Notice of RAD Rent, you will invariably see that your per unit rent will be substantially higher than an ordinary public housing rent. Because the Faircloth-to-RAD transaction essentially combines operating fund with capital funds. So that's another great thing for PHA to consider if they have the Faircloth authority to do it. The next step is environmental assessment. Anytime, as you know, you use federal funds, you have to conduct environmental assessment. And our field office folks would help you do that, whether you're going to do a Part 50 or Part 58. Next is design and construction contracts. With your team as the developer, as the lead, all of these things will be done through your team. Again, disposition, approval, and demolition. If you need to demolish, all of this will have been addressed at the pre-development stage, and the actual demolition can take place now, if not before. And at this point, you can then submit a development proposal to a grant manager, and then we can work with you to work out all of the essential aspects of it, all the way to closing. So that's the development stage. At the closing, almost the role of HUD will be complete. Construction will then begin. And after construction is done, if this is a Faircloth-to-RAD, they can consider converting to RAD. Next slide, please. So this is construction. So clearly, pre-development, development, we got the funding. That's the essential part of development phase. You got the funding, the funds to do the construction. Construction funding, permanent funding. And then we go through all the requirements, and then we provide an approval letter, and we authorize you to start construction. And that's this phase. So you communicate with all your stakeholders, your residents, your lenders, and occasionally HUD. So this is the construction period. Next slide, please. Now, construction is done. Part of your team will be a property manager. Identify at the pre-development and development stage. Property manager conforms with the approved leasing requirements. If this is a Faircloth-to-RAD transaction, it is at this stage that if public housing residents are going to occupy the units first, they will occupy the unit, and then the conversion will take place. But ordinarily, if it's just a regular misfinance transaction, the occupancy begins. The role of the PHA here is just to provide operating subsidy to the project. And all of these will have been identified and included in the development phase. This is not going to be a mystery to anybody. The exact amount and how it's going to flow will be decided way back at the development stage. Some PHA may decide to have asset management responsibilities, or they may just transfer or just provide these assets or this role to the property manager that the development approved or the owner entity approved. If anything happens, either during construction and afterwards, that requires some type of a refinancing or a lawsuit or lien being placed on the property, please, you have to let us know. All of this will be documented in your closing documents. But if anything happens to the project, please let us know so we can help you mitigate whatever needs to be mitigated. Next slide, please. Yes, as I was trying to discuss the development process, I tried to mention our role. So here it is, 5 steps. We work with you in preparing a development proposal and a calculator. And that's really the essential document because it tells us about everything about the project. What is it? Faircloth-to-RAD, misfinance only, operating subsidy only. Who is the developer? Who are the development team members? What is the role of the PHA? How many units? Is this on-site, off-site? All of this will work with you for you to be able to prepare this development proposal. You can get assistance from the field office too in providing certain approvals and some guidance. The important point is when you turn in a development proposal and a calculator, the proposal is basically the narrative that basically discusses what the project will be. Accompany the proposal is a development calculator which is the numbers. It talks about the financing, how everything is going to be done. So they are like a twin package. You can't submit one without the other. And you submit this, and hopefully in the development proposal, there'll be questions about the role of the various divisions of HUD, environmental review, whether there is any local or cooperative agreement. All of this will be in the development proposal. Next stage is the grant manager, somebody like me, will look at this proposal in tandem with you. And if everything is okay, we understand the deal, we think it's viable, it's consistent with the regulation, we then go to a panel of our peers. And the panel will review this, which is, I'm talking about step 3 now. And then the proposal will be approved. And then we begin the evidentiary process of actually evidencing the items we've discussed at pre-development, development, and construction. All of those documents we will put together. If I didn't mention, you have internal or outside counsels here helping the owner entity. The PHA may decide to have its own counsel, but you need experienced mixed finance counsel for whatever role the PHA may decide to play in the transaction. So step 4, we like the deal, we understand the deal, there are no issues or issues have been resolved, and we issue an approval letter, essentially telling you to go to construction, close the transaction and close construction. At the end of construction, you give us what we call a final binder. It's at this point, it's when we release the remaining funds for the PHA or to the owner entity. Next slide, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Abby. So I did want to highlight some of the key requirements of mixed finance projects. There are many more than what you see on this slide, but these are some key requirements to keep in mind as you're putting your deal together to make sure it'll meet our mixed finance criteria. So first, as I said earlier, and as Abby said, you can invest public housing capital funds and NTW funds to pay for the development of public housing units. But there are some limits on how much money you can invest in a mixed finance project. Some of those limits are the total development cost and housing construction cost limits that are published each year by the head Office of Capital Improvements. And then another financial guideline is called the pro rata test. And basically what that means is that public housing funds can only pay for the mixed finance development's public housing units. So if a mixed finance development has 25 public housing units and 75 non-public housing units, then public housing funds can only make up 25% of the development budget. Another key thing to review when you're putting together your financing for a mixed finance development has cost control and safe harbor standards, because these have guidelines for how high the developer fee can be, how high the construction fees can be, and the property management fees, as well as other costs. Finally, as Abby said, there are a lot of regulatory approvals that are required as part of the mixed finance approval process. One of those, of course, is environmental approval, and you need that for every single mixed finance development, regardless of whether you're using public housing capital funds in the development capital stack. Anytime you have a public housing unit being created or acquired, you need environmental approval. We also require architectural drawings to be approved by HUD for all mixed finance development projects, including Faircloth-to-RAD. And our primary concern in reviewing the drawings is ensuring that the development meets PHAs accessibility standards and that they meet livability criteria. We believe that public housing families and families who occupy other affordable units deserve to have high quality housing. They deserve to have livable units, and that's what we look for in our review. Another key thing to highlight is that all mixed finance public housing developments, including Faircloth-to-RAD, must obtain a front-end site and neighborhood standards review. And this review is conducted by HUD's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. And there are a number of criteria for what FHEO looks at when they're evaluating a site's compliance with site and neighborhood standard regulations. But this is a key review that I would encourage you and your PHAs to seek as soon in the development process as possible. As soon as you know your site and your unit mix, go ahead and approach FHEO for a site and neighborhood standards review. This is definitely something you don't want to be seeking right before financial closing. Next slide. And that really highlights a theme that I want to emphasize and end on. Seek approvals early. So when our office at headquarters gets the mixed finance development proposal, ideally you all would have already been talking with the SAC and the local field office to get these other approvals, because our final mixed finance approval that enables you all to go to financial closing and start construction is dependent upon you having already obtained a site and neighborhood standards approval, a Part 50 or 58 of environmental approval, architectural approval, everything you see here. Now, if you want to submit a mixed finance proposal and you haven't obtained all these yet, that is absolutely, totally, and completely fine. We are here to help you. We are very excited to work with you, and we're happy to help you navigate that process. I just want to highlight these approvals in particular because the earlier in the process you seek them, the smoother your mixed finance review and closing process will be. And I know we often get a lot of questions about site and neighborhood standards reviews. I find this to be a fascinating topic. And so we're actually partnering with the Office of Fair Housing Improvements to do a training specifically on site and neighborhood standards in March. So if you are interested in that training, be sure to email our@hud.gov, and we'll make sure you get the information to attend. Next slide. Finally, I want to thank you for listening to us today, joining us today. We are, as I'm sure you can tell, passionate about mixed finance development and how PHAs can use that. And we are really eager to work with you. So please email us anytime at our@hud.gov. That stands for Office of Urban Revitalization, our@hud.gov. We are happy to talk to you at any point in the development process, whether you're starting the process of coming up with a redevelopment plan, you simply have a site that you know you need to work on, or you secured tax credits and are working on putting together a development proposal. We always want to hear your ideas and your goals and partner with you to think about how you can achieve them. So thank you again for joining us. And now we can take questions.
Thank you so much, Tess. Thank you, Abby, for that great presentation. I see that we have some questions here in the Q&A. So I'll just jump right on to going through those and just, again, reminder for everyone, if you have any questions, please do add them to the Q&A section. So the first one we received is asking about, can these funding, mixed development funding, be used to build container homes with a rent-to-own financing for low-income families?
So I'm going to answer this, and then I'll see if Abby has additional insights to share. But in regards to using container homes, I think our key concern there would be, does the container home meet HUD's architectural standards for mixed finance development? As for rent-to-own financing, I have never in 10 years seen a mixed finance deal that had rent-to-own financing. I don't think, it's certainly not impossible. We could figure out how to do that probably, but it's not a typical use of the mixed finance development tool. That might be more of a home ownership project rather than a mixed finance project. Abby, anything to add there?
Well, I think you covered well, Tess.
All right.
All right, thank you. Will the funds have to be repaid? Is another question we got.
So Irene, I'm gonna assume that you are talking about public housing capital funds that a public housing authority is lending to a mixed finance project. And that is at the discretion of the housing authority. What we typically see is PHAs issuing soft second mortgages to a project that are repaid out of cash flow. So if you have a mixed finance project that has public housing units as well as other affordable or market rate units, the project may throw off some cash flow that could be used to repay the public housing authority for the capital funds it originally invested in the project. However, HUD does not have any requirement that those capital funds be repaid.
Great, thank you. And Irene, if you have any follow-ups, do feel free to. Pre-development, I think she just added something to her question down below.
Oh yeah, pre-development funds do not have to be repaid. But one thing to know is that whatever you invest in pre-development funding would figure into the total development cost. So if you're investing $1 million in pre-development and your TDC for a certain project is $10 million, that's feeding into your TDC limit.
Great. Thank you. Um, so I'm gonna move to a question about the wait list here, but for Musu Kennedy, if you could add some more context or a follow-up of your question about do we get certificated, um, that would be great before we get to your question. But for now, just gonna stick to this one we receive around 139. Aren't the waitlist requirements under RAD different? So how will this be reconciled in Faircloth-to-RAD conversion?
Abby, do you want to take this one?
No, I'm just going to, Antonella, ask the question again, please.
Yes. Aren't the waitlist requirements under RAD different? So how will this be reconciled in Faircloth-to-RAD conversion?
Okay. If I understand the question correctly, I'll try to answer it this way. In a Faircloth-to-RAD conversion, the residents are obviously, for the public housing units, are public housing residents. And they have to have been recruited or assigned from the existing wait list. It would be the same thing if this were to be a straight misfinance transaction, because in a typical misfinance transaction, a portion of the units will be public housing, and those public housing units will be filled from existing public housing wait list. So essentially, if I understand the question correctly, there is no difference because we're talking about public housing residents and they must be filled from existing public housing wait list, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Abby. I saw Kathy, maybe you came off mute.
No, I don't have anything to add right now. If there's a follow-up question or if Abby's response didn't fully answer, if they could ask the question again, that would be helpful.
I'll also say, as for Faircloth-to-RAD, when, the project has to get mixed finance approval, so we are closing the project as a mixed finance public housing project. So at closing, the public housing requirements are the requirements that apply. In our review, we do go ahead and look at compliance with a number of RAD criteria. And that's the minimum replacement reserve, that's the ownership requirements. But I think in terms of wait list and other requirements, you would be meeting the public housing requirements. And then after conversion, if you needed to take a different tact, you would do so once they were RAD units.
We do have a follow-up from that, asking since I believe Abby had alluded to, we're assuming that the property is occupied by public housing residents. The attendee is asking, what if the property is currently occupied by non-public housing residents? And they do agree with the answer, but they were confused by the slide which mentioned that PHA property manager will create a site wait list. So I think we might have had confusion there. But anything else that the HUD team would like to ask before we move on to the next one?
Well, I'm just going to say, if the question is, what, I think I heard you say, why does somebody else have to live in the building? You know, what we're talking about is a brand new construction or a rehabilitation financed under the mixed finance approach. So there is nobody living in the building. It's when the building is fully constructed or rehabilitated that folks who are eligible will move into the building. And if it's a mix of public housing and non-public housing, the folks that will move into the building that are public housing has to be public housing residents. Other folks, they have to be qualify per whatever the requirements of those qualifications are, if that makes sense.
Right.
Thank you. Great. Moving on to our next question. What data is the Site and Neighborhood Standard Assessment based on?
So yes, so A, this is a question that would best be answered during our training with FHCO. I will give you a short answer now, but I really encourage everyone on this webinar to attend the March training with FHCO on site and neighborhood standards. As for this, so when FHCO is reviewing a site, they look at census tract data for the proposed development site to look at things like the percentage of residents living in poverty and the percentage of residents who belong to a minority group and how that compares to the wider MSA. There are a lot of criteria for site and neighborhood standards. I can't review all of them at this moment, but again, please attend our webinar in March. We can provide you with both a much more detailed answer and B, a lot of good advice about how to submit a successful site and neighborhood standards application. The one thing I'll add right now on site and neighborhood standards is, you know, location matters. We all know that. And when you're picking a site to develop using mixed finance, you know, I think our successful PHAs do a fabulous job of picking sites that have access to amenities. So they have access to public transportation, they have access to quality schools, healthcare, job opportunities. So my advice is, you know, pick sites where you would want to live and raise your family, and ideally pick sites that are in areas of opportunity. I know there can be very good reasons to redevelop sites that are in slightly more depressed areas, but if you're doing that, use mixed finance development as an opportunity to talk to your city partners about how the city can reinvest in that neighborhood and help make it a better neighborhood for the families who will continue to occupy it.
Thank you, Tess. We have another question here asking what happens when there is a mixed finance property that is currently out of the 15-year compliance period, but the PHA now wants to reposition and revitalize the project since it is back in ownership hands of PHA. Is this project required to go through SAC approval prior to new redevelopment?
Yes, this is a great question. So this is taking up a lot of our time now, because, you know, a lot of our mixed finance developments were constructed 15 to 20 years ago, and there are many PHAs in this situation. So for the broad audience on the line, I want to clarify something and then help answer the question. So first of all, when the PHA assumes ownership of a project, almost every time that happens, that means that a PHA instrumentality or affiliate is comprising the project's owner entity, right? So the project continued to be mixed finance. It's still owned by a technical third party. It's just that the project's owner entity is comprised of Housing Authority instrumentality number 1 and Housing Authority instrumentality number 2, right? So the Public Housing Authority comprises the owner entity. And that happens a lot, like Abby said, at the end of that 15-year compliance period. Now, as for whether y'all have to go back to the SAC, you do not. So if you did mixed finance on a site that was previously public housing, the SAC has already approved of that site's disposition, and it does not need to issue any additional approvals. What you do need to do is to come back to our office, the Office of Urban Revitalization, because anytime you change the ownership of a mixed finance site, or anytime you put any new encumbrance on the mixed finance property, you need to talk to us and get HUD approval. We are seeing a lot of these right now, and we would love to talk to you and your team about the best way to revitalize a project. A final comment, you would approach the SAC or the RAD team if after 15 years you wanted to take that mixed finance property out of the public housing program. I will say, if you want to do that, the easiest way to do that is by going through RAD. Pretty much the only way to do that is by going through RAD. So if you're looking to reposition a mixed finance property, go through RAD. If you want to revitalize it and retain public housing, contact our@hud.gov.
Thank you. And I see new questions come up, so that's great. It seems like some of these are connected. So I'm gonna try to do my best to keep them together. Just before, I know we're gonna have a webinar in March, as Tess said, focusing on this, but we did have a quick follow-up about site and neighborhood standards. Do they apply to choice neighborhoods on site redevelopment, Tess?
No, they do not. Choice neighborhoods is exempt from site and neighborhood standards review for the housing units redeveloped within the target neighborhood. The reason for that is because choice neighborhoods is a comprehensive development program, and so there's ample funding being invested in improving the surrounding area. So if you're doing choice neighborhoods housing outside of the target neighborhood, you would have to do a site and neighborhood standards review.
Great, thank you. Someone else asked, how do we request an NIR? NAR.
Abby, why don't you take that one?
Yes, if you are interested in doing Faircloth-to-RAD, so the very first step really is to secure a NAR, NARR, Notice of Anticipated RAD Rent. And the ideal way to do that is to talk to your public housing field office folks, in addition to seeking guidance from the RAD resource desk. Our Office of Urban Revitalization, will work with you and our RAD colleagues in producing the document. But that's really this step in order to be sure that you get the NAR. Reach out to the field office and the RAD resource desk, and then we'll take it from there. Recognizing that ultimately, Office of Urban Revitalization will issue the NAR, and that will be your ticket to really being a Faircloth-to-RAD transaction PHA.
Okay, thank you. So will the NAR rent amounts be issued during development change when construction is completed and we convert to RAD? Is another related question we got.
Okay, good question. So once a PHA has secured NAR, and then we go into the development approval process. Now, understanding that the NAR is the basis of the underwriting of the transaction. So what happens is it's very streamlined. Faircloth-to-RAD transactions are streamlined. The underwriting is done once, and then we close the transaction as a regular public housing with the same NAR rents. And the same rents continue after the conversion to RAD, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
Okay. Another attendee asked if the PHA already owns a non-public housing property that it wishes to convert to public housing and then pursue RAD, and has the Faircloth authority for this addition to the PHA stock. Is the SAC application this first step in order to achieve their goal?
Yes. So I might have Jane Ornstein weigh in on this as well, because she's the director of the SAC. But so there's always a question before the answer. So one thing to consider is whether there is a declaration of trust on that non-public housing property. So the SAC approves a transfer in the ownership of a public housing property, a property that is under DOT. So if your PHA bought land with public housing funds, that land should be under DOT, and therefore it needs SAC approval to be released rather from the DOT. If your PHA bought land with non-public housing funds and there's never been a DOT on that site, then you do not need to request SAC disposition approval. Jane, do you have anything to add?
No, Tess, I think that's right. This is if they're bringing in non-public housing property.
Right.
So when they bring it in, they just put the DOT on it and then it goes out through RAD. So that works.
Yeah. When you, just to clarify, if it's non-public housing property at mixed finance closing, you would put a declaration of restrictive covenants on the property, and then that would be released and replaced with RAD use agreement when the property converted to RAD.
Great, thank you. Is there any guidance on what kind of PHA entities are appropriate in different situations? When would it be appropriate to use an instrumentality versus an affiliate versus a whole independent entity?
Yeah, Kathy, that is a great question. So it is really up to the PHA and their own needs. I will say, so for those of you who don't know, a PHA instrumentality is basically a legal entity that is completely controlled by the PHA. It has the same board and the same employees, and it's, it's a separate legal entity, but it's entirely run by the PHA. An affiliate is a closely related entity that is a bit more separate from the PHA. So it might have, some of its board members are PHA board members, but not all of them. So I wouldn't say there's hard and fast guidance on which one to use. I would simply say that there are different requirements from a procurement perspective. So if
actually, Tess, can I step in here for a second?
yeah, let me finish my comment and then I can and then you can step in. So if a PhD instrumentality is developing a project, that is such a closely related entity to the PHA that the PHA doesn't have to procure that instrumentality. The instrumentality, however, would have to procure the subcontractors. By contrast, if an affiliate or a wholly independent development entity is developing the project, then the PHA has to procure that affiliate or that third-party developer, but the third-party developer doesn't have to procure its subcontractors. So there is a slight difference in the procurement requirements depending on what type of entity you're using. Jane?
Yeah, actually, the instrumentality versus affiliate versus wholly independent are creations of the IRS, not HUD. As far as HUD is concerned, if it's independent according to the state, and you can get us a certificate in good standing from the state, we will recognize it as an independent entity.
Yeah.
We're not as concerned with what that relationship is. The IRS, however, is. So you need to be very careful and talk to your lawyers.
Yes, that's an excellent point.
Don't we have a guidance? Don't we have a notice on this,
We
folks?
do have a notice on this. I'll look up
I don't remember it, but I think we do. So
we do. I think it's on our HUD Mix Finance website.
thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll try to find that notice and either add the link here or add it as a follow-up. Just making a quick note of that. All right, we have a couple more questions to go. Maybe we can spend, before we part, some time on some confusion regarding site-specific waitlist versus existing waitlist. I know we briefly touched on that before, but we had an attendee ask what is, it's a new construction without current residents. How do they go about that waitlist?
So I am not an expert on this, but my understanding is this is an area of PHA discretion. So some PHAs choose to develop a site-specific waiting list for a particular development. Others will fulfill the units using the general PHA wait list. So it's really a matter of PHA discretion.
Great, thank you. And is there a time limit on construction of a housing site?
No, there's not. I would say things to keep in mind is that you're only going to get mixed finance approval when you have secured firm commitments for all your other financing. And since most mixed finance projects include LIHTC, the low-income housing tax credit program certainly has time limits on construction. I would also say that, if you're not completing construction for 5 years. That's obviously something we're going to talk to you about and voice concerns about. But HUD itself doesn't have any specific requirements regarding construction timelines other than, the standard requirements for obligating and expending any capital funds you're investing in the deal.
Okay, thank you. So this kind of goes to the next question. The funds can be used for ground up construction, if you could confirm that.
Yes.
And then, great, and confirm if the PHA can work with a developer. And that,
Absolutely.
right, that goes to LIHTC mention that you made. And so, Daryl, if you had any follow-up to that, please feel free to add that. In Faircloth-to-RAD, is initial operating subsidy PUM the same as the approved RAD rent?
Abby, I'm going to shoot that one to you.
Yes. Could you repeat the question, Antonella? I'm having difficulty with my vent here. It's just so noisy.
Okay, yeah, sorry about that. So Danielle is asking, in Faircloth-to-RAD, is initial operating subsidy PUM the same as the approved RAD rent?
Okay, so it's important to understand the requirements of Faircloth-to-RAD. The Faircloth-to-RAD requires that you get a NAR. It's important to understand that. The NAR, Notice of Anticipated RAD Rent, that determines your rent, period. It's one time, and that's the underwriting criteria for the public housing units or the Faircloth-to-RAD public housing units. It's determined in conjunction with RAD policies, but it's that number. There is no other number. You close with that, and then you transition to RAD with the same number, if that makes sense. So it's all about the NAR. Once you get the NAR, that's your rent. That's your rent structure.
Great, thank you. So another attendee shares that they thought that if the PHA goes for Section 18 RAD blend for a 50-year mixed finance property, they need a Section 18 approval first. Is that correct?
Jane, this is for you.
Yes. If we do a Section 18 RAD blend for a 15-year mixed finance property, you would need Section 18 approval under that, yes. But you go through the RAD desk on that.
Mm-hmm.
RAD resource desk.
Right. Thank you. We have another attendee sharing that their PHA is planning a RAD Section 18 blend for a recertification rehab of a mixed finance LIHTC project, which has completed its 50-year compliance period. Their understanding is that they need to get a concurrent SAC and Office of Recap approval for the recertification transaction. Would that be correct?
Yes.
Great, thank you, Jane. And we have one more question back to NAR. Is a NAR subject to OCAF?
Subject to what, Antonella?
OCAF?
Well, Put it this way, once we use NAR as the underwriting numbers, it can be escalated by the inflation or escalator factor we have in the development proposal calculator. This is part of what we do during the development phase when the deals are actually underwritten and everybody sees how the rent would trend. I don't want to be categorical by saying yes, it's part of OCAP. That's why I'm saying what I'm saying. There is an escalator number that the owner entity provides, and the lenders all agree to that number. And that is then the basis of the trending. Does that make sense?
Debbie, if you have any follow-ups, do feel free to add them as soon as you can to the Q&A. And she did. Who funds the NAR? Is it HUD multifamily, like other RAD PBB or RAD PBRA?
Well, the NAR is essentially public housing operating subsidy, essentially. Because remember what we've discussed there. To do a Faircloth-to-RAD transaction, the question or the units under question as public housing have to be closed as public housing. And when we close public housing in this finance transaction, they get operating subsidy only in a regular niche finance transaction. So, innovation-wise, we came up with a NAR, which is a combination of operating subsidy that a regular public housing transaction will have gotten, and then super inlay that with the capital funds that the same unit will have gotten over time. So that's where going in on a Faircloth-to-RAD transaction, the operating subsidy or the rent is substantially higher than a regular public housing rent. That makes sense?
Abby, I could hear most of that, but I am getting a lot of feedback, and it does sound just like a lot of static in the background. Do you get the same thing, Tess?
Yeah, I can repeat what Abby said. So basically, the NAR is the property's anticipated rent. So that would come from that rent, when it is paid, would be a RAD PBV or RAD PBRA rent. So the NAR is the projection of what the RAD PV or RAD PBRA rent will be after conversion.
Great. And just a quick reminder for folks that might have raised their hands before. I did send you a message soliciting to please add any questions or comments to the Q&A, just in case you missed that webinar chat. So I will allow a couple more minutes for you to add your questions there. At this time, we're not unmuting attendees. Thank you for your understanding. And we do have a follow-up from Debbie saying that sounds like the same calculation for other RAD rents, meaning operating subsidy plus capital.
Yes.
When is the HAB contract dated then?
So the HAB contract would be signed after the RAD conversion. So you could sign a HAB at closing, but you would not sign the HAB contract until the units had achieved a public housing DOFA date and were eligible and actively converting through RAD.
Debbie says thanks. Thanks to you for your questions, Debbie. So we have a last pending question here. I wasn't necessarily sure if I understood it, but I'm going to share it just in case any of our panelists can identify what it is about. The question simply states, do we get certificated?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't know what that means. So if someone could illuminate on what they mean, that'd be great.
Great. Yes. So I, for now, marked your question as dismissed, as we're not 100% sure what you meant by that. But please, if you could come back and add it or expand on it, we're happy to get to it. One more question. If there is unforeseen disasters such as a flood or maybe vandalism, and the budget increases, can PHAs receive additional funding to address these unforeseen issues?
Yeah, so a couple principles for answering that question. So it would depend in part on whether or not the investment of public housing capital funds in the development was at their TDC limit. So if the PHA had only, if they hadn't maxed out the amount of public housing capital funds it could provide to the project, the PHA could theoretically invest more public housing capital funds in the project in event of a disaster. If it had maxed out the amount of public housing capital funds it could invest, then we could talk about an extraordinary site cost waiver, but there are specific criteria for how to meet an exception to invest additional public housing funds. Now, if you're paying for increased costs with non-public housing funds, then you wouldn't necessarily need HUD approval, but you would need to come back to HUD to notify us of the financing changes. And certainly if you're putting any new encumbrances on the project, like a new mortgage, you have to get approval from HUD before you do that.
Thank you, Ted. We have another question related to this, or I can be asked, can you receive a RAD designation on a previously approved LIHTC mixed finance property if a Section 18 disposition approval was provided at the time of mixed finance approval / closing?
Yes, I believe you can.
Okay. I think that brings us to the end of our Q&A section. Tess, would you like to walk us through the appendix, or do you want folks to go through that on their own time?
I'm going to let people go through that on their own time, but again, I will just put a plug in for OUR at HUD.gov. We would love to talk to you in more detail to answer your questions and to walk you through the proposal development process.
Great. Thank you, Tess. Just showing folks what you can find in the appendix once you receive the slide deck. We appreciate you. Thank you to our panelists for their time, and thanks to you for attending. Again, the recording will be available in about 2 weeks next to the slide deck as well. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.